Hey everyone, it's Wasabi and welcome back. So for flicking, is a speed pad actually better than a control pad? Because I think a lot of people hear the word speed and immediately assume, well, faster pads means faster flicks. But honestly, for most people, bad flicks are not a speed problem. It may very well be a stopping problem. Because flicking is not about how fast you can start the movement, it's about whether you can actually stop the mouse where you want it to stop. And that is exactly why for most people, a control pad is usually the safer choice for flicking. But of course, this topic is very broad. There is no one size fits all. Most people already know that, but still gotta start somewhere, especially for gamers who are not too familiar, and that is perfectly fine. Now, the easiest way to understand this is to think of a flick as having two parts. First, there is the kickoff. That is the moment you start the movement. And then there is the stop. That's when you actually land on the target, or at least close enough that you barely need to correct much after that. And this is where speed pads and control pads feel different. A speed pad helps the kickoff because there is less friction, so the mouse gets moving more easily. Whereas for a control pad, it helps the stop because the extra friction gives you more braking, so it is easier to settle the mouse where you want it to. Most times, a bad flick doesn't happen because you couldn't start the movement fast enough. They happen because the stop wasn't clean enough for what feels natural to you. That's where the overshoot comes in. That's where the under flick comes in. And that's where your micro adjustments after the flick can start feeling awkward too. And that is why this topic isn't as simple as just saying speed equals better flicking. Now, if you're talking about tactical FPS like Valorant or Counter-Strike, then I do think a control pad usually makes more sense for most players. And the reason is pretty simple. A lot of your fights come down to one clean shot, one short moment, and one precise stop. So even if a faster pad helps you to start the flick faster, that doesn't really mean much if you can't stop properly on the target. And that is exactly where control pads help a lot. They reduce overshooting, especially if you panic flick. They make your mouse feel more predictable, and overall they make the flick feel more locked in when the pressure is on. That gives you confidence to actually commit to the shot because you trust that the mouse is going to stop where you want it to. And in tactical FPS, I think for a lot of people that matters a lot. So for this style of FPS, I do think that a control pad is the safer and more effective choice. Not because speed pads are bad, but because in tech FPS, I do believe that the stop matters just as much as the start. Now, on the other hand, in faster paced FPS like Overwatch and even something like The Finals, I can completely understand why people enjoy speed pads more. Because in those games, there's more movements, more repeated snap turns, and more moments where you're tracking, then flicking, then tracking again. That is where the easier stop and more fluid movement of a speed pad can feel really nice. You know, the mouse feels lighter to move, quick turns take less effort, repeated snap movements feel more effortless, and overall, the whole experience can feel more agile and more responsive in chaotic fights. And in games like that, there are definitely moments where being ready for the next adjustment matters just as much as cleanly finishing the first one. But of course, for this sort of pad, there is a trade-off where you get less help with stopping, so your hand has to do a little more work. And if your stopping control isn't that good yet, a speed pad will expose that very quickly. But honestly, I do not think that that's such a bad thing, because sometimes a speed pad shows you very clearly whether your aim is actually under control or whether the pad was helping you more than you thought. So should you use a control pad or a speed pad? Well, generally I would go based on the type of game that you play the most. If you mainly play tactical FPS like Valorant or Counter-Strike, I think a control pad makes more sense. Or if you mainly play something faster and more movement heavy like Overwatch or The Finals, then I think a speed pad might be the better choice. And if you play a mix of both games like I do, then personally I think balanced control pads make the most sense for most people, because that's usually the safest middle ground. You know, you get enough speed that the mouse doesn't feel sluggish, and you get enough stopping power that you still feel confident when you need to flick and stop cleanly. And honestly, that is probably my biggest recommendation in this whole video. Unless you already know that you love the extremes, the sweet spot for most people is usually somewhere in the middle. You know, not a muddy control pad that feels like it's dragging behind your hand, and not a super fast pad that it makes you feel like you're gliding on ice. Just something balanced that you don't have to think so much about, and you know, just enjoy the game. Now, of course, there there is no fixed rule and these are just general recommendations, there are definitely times when I'll main a WALLHACK glass pad and still play Valorant just fine after I settle in. Now here's something else that I think is worth mentioning. If you already have a mouse pad that you like, you know you don't always need to replace the entire pad. And that's because you can adjust the feel of the mouse pad with mouse skates. If your setup feels too fast, control skates can add a bit more friction and help with the stopping power. Or if your setup feels too slow, speed skates can make the mouse feel more lively and easier to move. And the same goes for dot skates versus full-size skates. Dot skates often feel faster because there's less surface contact, whereas for full-size skates it usually feels a bit more stable and controlled with the glide. So before you go and buy a completely different mouse pad, sometimes the easier move is just changing the skates first. That alone can shift the experience by quite a lot. Sometimes the problem really isn't your pad, it's just the glide that could do with a bit of tweaking. So at the end of the day, just keep it simple. Speed helps you start the flick, control helps you to stop it. I'm trying not to use so much of the friction terms because it can get a bit confusing for new people. So to put it simply, in most cases, the stop is the part that actually decides whether the flick lands cleanly or not. So when you're choosing between a speed pad and a control pad, ask yourself this: where is the problem happening? Is it the start of the movements that is giving you trouble, or are you struggling with stopping? Because most of the time that tells you exactly what you need. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful in any way, please leave a like and subscribe to support my channel, and I guess I'll see you in the next one.